Hello, my name is Guy Mock and I'm the Head of Customer Experience at the UK Hydrographic Office. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today, Shaping the Future of Navigation with S-100. It's going to explore the role that S-100 will play in transforming the way we make navigational decisions. Many of you on this webinar will have varying levels of understanding and experience of S-100, but I think that's fine, and it represents an opportunity for us to have this conversation and understand how S-100 can help us with some of the most critical challenges facing the industry today. With me, I have three panellists who I'll introduce shortly. But first, I just want to make it very clear that we really appreciate your questions coming in throughout this webinar, and you should have that opportunity on the screen now. So just to make sure that the technology is working correctly, if you wouldn't mind answering the question that's there, which is whereabouts in the world you are dialing in from. So just while you're doing that, I'm just going to check and also let you know that you will see the option to prioritize the questions that are coming in. So whilst the first half of the webinar is me asking the panelists some questions with some questions from yourselves, it's also really important for the latter stages that you prioritize the questions and the content that we want to discuss. So just looking at that, it appears to be working. We have people dialing in from a lot of different continents and countries, so thank you very much. So I'd now like to introduce our panelists. From the UK Hydrographic Office, we have Tom Mellor. Tom is the Head of Technical Partnerships at the UKHO, and he has been instrumental in developing the current S-57 standard as well as the incoming S-100 standard by working with the International Hydrographic Organization, the IHO, as well as ECDIS manufacturers, who throughout this webinar will likely refer to as OEMs. We also have Michelle Tarr. Michelle is a Senior Product Manager at the UKHO and has over 15 years of customer-facing experience and has also been working with ports with some live data trials, which we'll come on to later on. We also have John Southam, who is the Loss Prevention Director at North Standard P&I Club, who are a leading marine insurer, and as well as that perspective, John's also spent over 19 years at sea as a master mariner. So thanks very much for being here. It's quite astonishing, really. It doesn't feel like that long ago, you know, Tom and Michelle, but 10 years ago at the UKHO, we were talking about the mandatory carriage of ECDIS. And so much has happened over that time, and the industry has really embraced the benefits of digital navigation. But if we look at the amount of insight and data at our fingertips now, that really creates the platform for S-100 to leverage more informed decision making. So for those who watching, Tom, who maybe aren't as familiar with S-100 as yourself, could you provide an overview of this new generation of data standards, please?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. And I think what you said just then is really important. I think it's good to reflect on where we've come from. S-57 was designed and built approximately 20 years ago now, but it's been extremely successful, an extremely successful story of how standardization can be brought to an industry. And we have now over 70 IHO member states creating electronic navigational charts that all can be read in over 50 different ECDIS makes models that are being used by over 50 to 60,000 vessels trading internationally. So this is a really good success story with S-57 and what we've been able to achieve within our industry. But 20 years is quite a long time, and especially in this last 20 years, as we've seen technology really move at a real rapid pace, and computing power now is very, very different to when I first started working in ENCs, when we were using floppy disks to transfer data around. So we've come a long, long way, and the success of S-57 has relied quite heavily on the fact that the standard had to be frozen so that the implementation of the data could be done in a way that would allow a period of stability for ECDIS manufacturers. But in doing so, what that's meant is we can't really accommodate any technological change within the standard very easily. And ships face an enormous task when having to try and update the ECDIS systems when they're in service. If there's a need to update an ECDIS system or change the E&C product, we have to design the patches, and then the vessel needs to come out of service, an engineer needs to be sent on board to update the ECDIS system, and all of this takes time and costs a lot of money. So when we're looking at new standards and how we bring those out to the market, we need a much more flexible regime to be able to extend the standard without breaking anything. And this is where S-100 really comes in. So the IHO haven't just designed S-100 on their own. They've gone out and looked at what standards are available for the determination of geographic information. And there is a family of ISO standards, the ISO 19100 family of geographic information standards, that the IHO have used to develop S-100 and this new data framework for hydrographic information. We've essentially picked all of the best parts of the ISO standards to be able to create this new S-100 framework. And the beauty of basing it on the ISO standards is it should help with interoperability with other domains that use those ISO standards to develop their products as well. One of the core components of the S-100 framework is something called the IHO registry. And this is effectively an online database where all of the hydrographic information that you could possibly imagine is fed into this repository. And it's from this central repository of all the information that we're then able to start to create the catalogue files for each of the different product specifications that we'll hear a lot more about today. We were at a seminar recently in Hamburg at SMM, and one of the questions that came up from the panellists was, if I've got some S-100 data, S-101 in my ECDIS system, and I get some S-200 data, will it overwrite my data? What does S-200 mean? And I think there may be some confusion at the moment because people are starting to see product specifications being developed by different organisations that are using the S-100 infrastructure. So those numbers that you see do actually have a meaning. And in the registry, we have what we call domains. So the S1 domain is owned by the IHO, and this is where a lot of the products that we'll talk about today have been developed. So we have S101, UENC, and all of the other S1 products in that domain, controlled and operated by the IHO. But then you have the S200 domain, and that's owned and operated by IALA. So IALA are busy using the S100 infrastructure to develop product specifications specific to their domain. S500 has been designated as a domain for defence. So over time, we'll start to see defence-based products that use that S100 infrastructure that will be registered in that area. There are other organisations that are also using S100 to develop product specifications. The World Meteorological Organization have been developing weather overlays and ice overlays, and the International Electrotechnical Commission have been developing a standard route format for the exchange of route information from ship to shore and shore to ship. So there are lots of organisations that are using the S100 infrastructure to start to build product specifications. And all of this means that hopefully, as we're now using the same standard data model, that the products become interoperable and will work together in a standard method. So S100 has also now been adopted by the IMO as the data framework for the specification of maritime services, which are used in e-navigation. And this is a really important point because with the IMO now recognising the importance of S100, we're starting to see other initiatives come to the fore now. And some people may be aware that recently, back in November 22, the IMO adopted the new S-100 performance standard for ECDIS. And this was a real key moment, really, because now we're starting to see the industry move from your S-57 ECDIS, which is pretty static, to a new S-100 ECDIS that has the capability to display all of these new data products, these new product specifications that we're developing as hydrographic offices. And there are some key dates that have been introduced in the new performance standard. The first is from the 1st of January 2026. If ECDIS systems, S-100 ECDIS systems are available and have been type approved, then from that date forward, it's permissible for new builds and retrofits and things like that to fit an S-100 ECDIS system. That is now allowable from that date. But from the 1st of January 2029, the IMO intend to retire the older performance standard, which referenced S-57, which will then leave only the S-100 ECDIS performance standard. And from that date forward, if you need to fit a new ECDIS system on your vessel, then you will only be able to fit S-100 ECDIS, because that's the only compliance standard left in service.
Thanks very much. Michelle, as Tom mentioned, there's a whole range of product specifications that make up the S-100 family, but could you introduce a few of the standards that are currently under development that we're going to be exploring today?
Yeah, so here at the UKHO, we've been predominantly looking at what is referred to as phase 1 products. So they're supporting route monitoring. And then there's phase 2 products, which look at route planning. There are a whole host of other S-100 standards, which Tom has just touched on, such as S-200, 400, 500. But for those watching at home, you should start to see examples of those product specifications on screen now. So here today, we're going to focus on mainly 4 product specifications from the phase 1 release. The first being S-101, which is the product specification for electronic navigational charts. This will ultimately replace S-57 in the future, but is a foundational layer that all the other product specifications can be overlaid upon. Then there's S-102, which is the product specification for bathymetric surface, which shows granular detail of the seafloor and is derived from hydrographic surveys. Then for tidal information, there's S-104, which is water level information for surface navigation, and S-111, which is surface currents. Now, those are 2 product specifications that I've been particularly interested in and working with ports to understand the user value, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about that later on. But the great thing about these product specifications is, as Tom said, they're all interoperable, and that provides great benefits to the mariner and the maritime industry. So I look forward to talking through some of those later.
Great, thanks. Tom, Michelle mentions S-101 being the base layer for ENC, for other S-100 datasets. So how will S-101 ENCs differ from the ENCs being used today?
That's a great question. I think for mariners, they don't want a huge amount of change moving between S-57 and S-101. And because of that, we've kept a lot of the information in terms of symbols very similar, so that there is no confusion or safety issue when moving between one data source and the other. And this is because when we get to the first generation of S-100 ECDIS systems, they're going to be dual fuel systems, so they're going to have the ability to simultaneously display both the S-57 and the S-101 chart together. But there are some differences that have been built into the new S-101 charts, from feedback on mariners, making sure that we are taking their views into consideration and building them into the next generation of products. And the first thing that I'd like to just touch on is the fact that in the new ENCs, we have the ability to orientate text, which has never been an option before in your S-57 ECDIS. And hopefully you'll be able to see on the screen now an example of an S-57 chart alongside a new S-101 chart with the text orientated. And this will really have some big benefits, I think. Where hydrographic offices choose to encode that information, we will be able to deconflict that text from the E&C, hopefully reducing clutter, meaning that the text can be turned on at all times for the end user, so that if they're entering a port that they're not familiar with, they have to call up the VTS, for example, and they say go to Anchorage berth 5 or whatever it is. That information is on the screen, and it's very easy then to be able to make that maneuver and do what you're being asked without having to turn everything on, or there's a cluttered display because you can't find that information. So the more cartographic intelligence that we can put into the S101 charts, I think the better it'll be for the end user. And for those that are very familiar with using an ECDIS and the symbology that we have today, there is a simplified symbol set, which has been simplified shapes on the screen. But for the more traditional shapes that we have, like the buoy shapes, they've always been just the outline of the symbol without any colour. And we now in S101 will have a coloured buoy shape, which will look more like the paper chart, but all of the buoyage will be coloured. And I think you can now see an example of that on the screen as well. And finally, one of the biggest issues that mariners always complain about to me when I'm talking to them about ECDIS is alarms. And we've had many instances in the past where there's been alarm fatigue, and it's been a real problem for crews. So taking that on board, one of the things that the UKHO has been keen to do is to try and reduce the number of features that would raise audible alerts or alarms in the system. And one of the ways that we're going about doing that is to create a new feature in an S101 E&C called an information object. And this will enable hydrographic offices to encode things like caution areas into info objects instead of having them as strict caution areas. And this will help to alleviate the problem of them inadvertently, I suppose, alerting or indicating in the ECDIS system when you're planning your passage, and having the crews having to spend time interrogating that information unnecessarily when it may not be a caution to their vessel. So this really will assist them in that respect. So there's a lot of nuanced features that are being brought into S101, but things that we hope won't cause any issues with the navigational safety of the vessel.
Okay, thanks very much. Lots of appreciative smiling and nodding from John there with some of those practical benefits. But before we come to John, I'm just going to look at the Q&A because questions have been coming in. If you wouldn't mind just reminding you to prioritise them, to continue to prioritise them as they come in, that's very helpful. Tom, the one that's got the most votes at the moment is, will the chart permits licensing style remain the same?
So no is really the answer to that. And the reason is because the security scheme with S100 has improved, but to make those improvements, key lengths and things like that you currently have for user permits in your ECDIS system have been extended, and therefore the permits will be different for S100 data from the data that you have for S57. So to improve the security, there have been changes made, which will mean that the S100 data is secured slightly differently. We have concepts of digitally signing all of the files now within a S100 exchange set to ensure the integrity of the information gets to the end user in a form which proves that it's been untampered. We currently don't have that capability in S57 or S63 at the moment, and so these are some of the things that S100, some of the advantages S100 will bring when we move across to that, is that increased security.
Okay, I was going to take one more question, which is also also for you because it relates to hardware. With S-100 standards, how will the existing hardware comply? Will owners require to upgrade the hardware?
So this question's come up quite a lot whilst we've been talking to the industry, and in conversations with OEMs at the moment, some are expecting that they will be able to upgrade existing hardware to be able to read S-100 data. But there is a big caveat here, and it does depend largely on the capability of your current hardware. If you're running the very latest ECDIS makes and models, then the possibility of upgrading is greater, I would say. But we can't guarantee anything, because we don't make the ECDIS, do we? So that's the challenge. But I think that it's most likely that upgrades may be possible if you're running with the latest hardware. If you're not and you're running very older ECDIS systems, then the likelihood is that when the time to transition occurs, then you will be probably purchasing S-100 ECDIS. And I think our job today here is, and through the trials and test beds, is to convince owners and operators that there's real value and benefit in moving over to these new standards and these new systems. And if we can demonstrate the value there and what this will bring, then hopefully they'll recognise the value and move across voluntarily.
Thanks very much. So, John, I mean, Tom just touched on benefits. North Standard insure 20% of the world's fleet currently, so you've got a pretty good view of the challenges faced by shipping companies on a global scale. But in your view, what role does or could S-100 play in underpinning safe and efficient voyages?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. So working for a loss prevention team inside a P&I club has two main sort of strains to it, if you like. The front end is information provision and training, making sure that our members, the ship operators and owners, are as up to date with regulations and best practice as possible. Then, of course, the other element to that is dealing with the claims themselves and helping the claims handlers with technical information. And we learn lessons from those, which obviously feed back into that front end. So starting with that sort of front end, the information provision and training that we like to do, the club, North Standard, launched its ECDIS training assessment last January. And whilst we can't see the individual member and crew results, we can see the overall data. And that has allowed us to see where areas of strengths and weaknesses currently are within sort of crew members' knowledge. And a lot of that has backed up already what Tom has spoken about this morning. So choosing just a couple of the areas of weakness, for example, display, clutter and decluttering the layers of information that are available on there. There seems to be a slight disconnect in understanding where crew members are taking off too much or complaining there's too much clutter on the screen. And we've already heard from Tom that has been considered in the S-100 standard with this cartographic feature that allows them to keep the information on whilst decluttering the screen. So a clear safety benefit if used correctly at that point. Another area of weakness in knowledge was safety settings in use. So whilst there was a good knowledge amongst crews in what those safety settings were, such as safety contour and safety depth and things like that, the slight weakness was in what they were interpreting as that they saw on the screen, in particular with that safety contour, which is obviously all important. There was a bit of a misunderstanding that because S-57 ENCs came from paper charts, the data, that the contours were limited to an extent on the S-57 ENCs, and therefore if the crew member puts in their safety contour setting, there was a bit of a misunderstanding that if that wasn't available on the screen, that contour, it would drop to the next one and therefore cut out quite a large percentage of therefore navigable water. And that coupled with a bit of a misunderstanding on how they could navigate behind that safety contour with an element of confidence if done properly. And the contours, of course, as we've heard and we'll hear more about, has that gradual data rather than just set contours when it moves to S-100. So there's clear safety benefits and obviously economic benefits in being able to operate closer, get into ports that maybe would have been behind the safety contour before. One of the biggest areas of weakness was ENC installation and updating. And in particular, crew being able to identify that ENCs were at their most up-to-date status, how they did that and what they saw on the screen to make sure that what they were using was the most up-to-date and automatically corrected ENC. And that is something that will also change with S-100, and that will be more apparent where those changes have been and that they're more up-to-date. The beauty of that particular one is that feeds directly into the passage planning of the vessel. And passage planning has come under particular scrutiny of late, and I'll move on to why that is in a second. So moving then to that back end and helping dealing with the claims that do occur, the main ECTIS related claims are of course groundings, which can be extremely big ticket items. Not every single one is, but a lot of them can be. We can talk about crew injury, vessel damage, environmental damage, and ultimately, again, looking at the commercial aspects of it, it can be reputational damage for the member themselves who have the grounded vessel. And that often boils down to a lack of understanding about how to calculate underkeel clearance or errors in how they're calculating the underkeel clearance, the data available to allow them to calculate that underkeel clearance. And one of the main powers, as I see it, with S-100 is if you use the different standards. So, for example, with underkeel clearance 101, 102, 104, 11 sort of combined together to give you a dynamic underkeel clearance calculation for that time. And that's clearly, therefore, of great benefit to the crew member who is getting fed more accurate information and removing that margin for error when referring to the underkeel calculations. And that feeds into what I was talking about with passage planning. That area there, underkeel clearance and installation and updating, will form part of the seafarer's appraisal in passage planning. And an appraisal is where you gather all the information, relevant information together, similar to a risk assessment, if you like, to identify hazards and make sure that you can navigate as safely as possible. And passage planning has come under that scrutiny recently. And the main reason for that is because of the CMA CGM Libra, which many of the listeners will have heard about. And what happened with that particular vessel, while she wasn't using ECTIS, it was actually on paper charts, it still remains pertinent, that she was departing a port in China, using the Boyd Channel. For some reason, she decided to depart that channel and navigate outside the Boyd Channel. Looking at the chart at first glance for the crew at the time, the soundings looked adequate to do so. Unfortunately, the vessel grounded, and it became apparent in the investigation that there was a T&P notice for that area she grounded to say that the soundings as represented on the chart may not be accurate. Now, that was not put on the chart by the crew, which again, as I said, would form part of that passage planning. So it was found in the end that that error in the passage plan was causative to that grounding. So it was deemed that if there is an error in the passage plan that is causative to an incident, has to be causative to the incident, then the vessel, because of that faulty passage plan, if you like, can be deemed unseaworthy at the start of the voyage, which is a basis for cover and defence for any claims. So that's why it came under scrutiny. And one of the problems with appraisal old school is that the sources of information are varied and very wide. So the crew member had to go get things from over here and gather it all together to make that appraisal. S-100, with all these different standards and information that will be available, particularly in phase 2 when that's added as well, will be very much a one-stop shop for passage planning and that appraisal and that risk assessment. Again, it'll start to remove the chances of error. It's still got to be used properly, but it will remove the chances of error, such as not marking the chart up or not realising that your chart is as up-to-date as possible. And then for us as a club, there are also legal disputes, such as speed and performance claims, one of the problems we have in dealing with those when they come to particularly the loss prevention side is historical weather, surface currents and things like that. And again, the S-100 platform will allow us to gather that kind of data and hopefully reach more amicable commercial settlements for our members as well.
Thanks very much. I mean, building on that, Tom, how does more granular data improve safety and situational awareness?
I think John's touched a bit on some of the drawbacks we have with our S57 charts, in that we copied them largely from paper charts, and the paper chart in contour intervals available are generally a lot less than is required by the ECDIS user today and the digital data of today. So as John said, if you have a 12-metre vessel, 12-metre draft vessel, and you put that value into your safety contour in your ECDIS system, what happens is there is no 12-metre safety contour in your ECDIS, so it defaults to 20 metres. And now the mariner has, if they wish to, cross the safety contour into this potentially dangerous area and navigate in 8 metres of what is safe water for them. And the way that they have got around that problem in the past is by turning on your soundings. So this actually clutters the screen a bit, because the soundings are in all other display, so you're turning on a lot more information. And then what happens is the safety depth that you've selected, if you've put 12 metres as well, it will change the colour of the soundings based on that information. So if it's a sounding which is shoaler than your safety depth, then they will turn black. And what the mariners are effectively doing is they are playing dot to dot, and they are going between the soundings, drawing on their own safety contour in the ECDIS system. Now, this is clearly not a safe practice, really, but one which we know is going on, and is a consequence of hydrographic offices or the way in which we've produced our E&Cs traditionally previously. But moving towards S-100, we now have the ability to take those high-resolution multi-beam surveys that are done and create bathymetric surfaces of information, and then effectively have these gridded cells of bathymetric information, which will allow, when integrated with the S-101 data, the ability to drop out the depth information that exists within your S-101 chart and replace that with your S-102 data. And this is going to be a real big game changer, because you'll now get a much, much more accurate safety contour in the ECDIS system. The hydrographic offices also have the ability to alter the grid resolution of that S-102 chart. So we've experimented with different grid resolutions in port operations. So when we first did some S-102 trials down at PLA, we experimented with a 2-metre grid size, with 10-metre grid sizes, and with 100-metre grid sizes, just to see how the pilots would react to that type of information. And it transpired for our use in that port operation that they wanted 10-metre grid going up through the channel, but then when they got to the more critical berthing of the vessel, they wanted a 2-metre grid resolution at the berth, going over a particularly shoal sandbank, so that they could monitor the movement of the vessel in more detail. So I think for each operational area, potentially, there are options for grid sizing in our S-102. But one of the key benefits of an S-100 ECDIS, which will really revolutionise, I think, operations for seafarers, is this concept of a dynamic safety contour. And when we bring in the new data set S-104, which is your tidal water levels, this can be added on top of that gridded bathymetry to now move up and down as the tidal effects take take force, really. So your safety contour, if you're in a channel, you'll see over time, and if it's a semi-diurnal tide, will just shift in and out as the tide goes up and down. And this is going to be a really big benefit, not just for navigational safety, but I think Michelle will touch on some of the port operations and how some of these things will unlock other operational benefits for end users using these new data sets.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, truly transformative. Michelle, given your recent work with ports, as Tom touched on, to test and trial data sets, in a port environment, how does S-100 improve safety and efficiency?
Yeah, so I do want to just touch on the work that we have been doing with ports over the last 2 years or so. So we've been working with a number of different ports around the UK, and those have been chosen for particular reasons. So either their geographical location, whether they're tidally restricted or have particularly strong currents, for example. And within those trials, what we've been looking at is the user value. It's important to us as a Hydrographic Office that we are providing this data in a way that adds benefit out to the user. So within those ports, we've been looking at a number of different use cases. So mariners using ECDIS hardware, vessel traffic services and other port services using a variety of different software solutions, as well as pilots using portable pilot units. And as Tom said, I think one of the main benefits that we've noticed is that the data sets are truly interoperable, and that provides a number of efficiencies, mainly the dynamic safety contour that Tom's just mentioned. So what that does do is allow the user to see the water levels change as see the contour change as the water level does. And for the first time ever, there'll be a temporal element to that as well. So the user can see the water level adjust through a time series. Now, particularly for the Port of London Authority, what they'd identified was that change in water levels over a time series was particularly useful in supporting the pilots in the master pilot exchange element, which it can be that one of the most, I don't want to say dangerous, but the most fractious elements of that because of the time constraints. And also by providing 111, can see the effects that the different currents has on that vessel. There are a number of other benefits as well that we've identified through those trials. So an economic benefits, for example, by providing S-102 and S-104 in a gridded format, we're able to provide the user much clearer underkill clearance calculations, much more precise. Now that's enabled by our ability to provide a forecast model within the 104 data. Now what that does is provide the user not just the astronomical tidal predictions, but also include the effects that the meteorological information has on the tide as well, such as atmosphere or the surge, for example. So if we think about that in the sense of a user, a terminal, for example, if we think about an average 400-metre vessel, calculations suggest that for every additional 10 centimetres of water that's been identified through the use of the S-100 data, the terminal will be able to load approximately an additional 100 containers, which equates to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Equally, the safety benefits as well. By having that forecast model available in the 104 and the much greater detail of the 102 and the interoperability of the data, it means that the port has a much greater awareness of the dynamic environment in which they're working in. So the data could demonstrate that there is actually less water than had been predicted, which supports the avoidance of groundings. Equally, it could demonstrate that there's more water than available, which is fantastic for the port, because if there's an inbound vessel that would have previously missed their tidal window, what that means is that vessel then avoids having to anchor outside of port limits and can come in. And that saves the shipping company money and anchorage fees as well.
Great. I mean, continuing the theme of efficiencies, decarbonisation is, a hot topic across all industries, but certainly across shipping. Can S-100 data play a part in supporting the decarbonisation agenda.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important topic, and so much so actually that the International Maritime Organization recently increased their decarbonisation targets and have committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But the short answer is yes, I do think that S-100 can support decarbonisation efforts. If we look out to industry, there are a number of different initiatives that are going on at the moment, such as looking at greener, cleaner fuels, anti-fouling paints, but they're expensive, they're time-consuming, and actually the S-100 data is a relatively inexpensive way of supporting decarbonisation efforts. S-111, for example, surface currents, provides the user with regularly spaced surface current information. Now, a mariner can use that information to identify favourable currents, and if they're able to identify that, it can support things like just-in-time arrival or reducing engine speeds to reduce fuel consumption. And if we're talking about fuel consumption equating to less greenhouse gas emissions, then actually South Korea and the US recently did a trial on shipping routes around the west coast of Korea. What they did within that trial is look at shipping routes and planning a route using traditional navigational data. Then they did the same exercise but used S-100 data to plan that route. They were able to identify much more efficient routes using the S-100 data and saved 45.5% of fuel, which is a massive saving. Now, obviously, it depends on the route, and we know that optimization is much better on the longer routes, but it just demonstrates that the S-100 data can help in those efforts. And as we look out to industry, there are some geopolitical issues going on at the moment, which means vessels are having to reroute to avoid those sensitive areas. So some of those rerouting can be much longer. And so if the mariner can use S-100 to find those efficiencies, reduce fuel and therefore their greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Before we move on to a final few questions, I'm just going to check what questions we have that have been submitted. Okay, good. The good news is there's lots of questions. The challenge is going to be getting through them. So we'll take a couple now before we then focus on trying to get through as many of these as possible. The question with the most votes is from Emiliano. With the transition to S-100 and its enhanced visualization capabilities, I'm curious whether the display of CATSOC information will evolve, and if so, in what way?
I think that might be for me then.
I think it is for you.
Okay. So this is really has been a real challenge, I think, for hydrographic offices and with industry to be able to deal with this. There is a new requirement in the performance standard, the S-100 performance standard, which asks for the ability to be able to, for the mariner to be able to take accuracy into account. And the way in which we have attempted to demonstrate that is by using the horizontal accuracy of CATSOC. And when this selector is turned on in the ECDIS system, what will happen is that the ECDIS will use the underlying CATSOC value that the route crosses to add an additional buffer around that route of the value which corresponds to the CATSOC area that they are in. So if you are in a CATSOC A1 area, which is the best quality survey information that we have available, then the minimal 50-metre cross-track distance would be added as a buffer around that route. And that would effectively incorporate some potentially additional features into your route check to make sure that you were aware that if these were significant features, that there's an uncertainty of that around them. So therefore we bring in a few more features into that route. If you get to the more catslock areas where the survey quality isn't so great, for example in catslock D, then you have the maximum horizontal cross-track distance added to your route. I think from memory that's 500 metres, but don't quote me on that. So that would be then added to that route in those particular areas. And this had to be a method, because we're in a dual fuel ECDIS, this had to be a method that could work both for S57 charts and S101 charts. So we will be keeping CATSOC in S101 so that we can meet the requirement in the new S100 performance standard for the mariner to be able to take accuracy into account when they're route planning. So that's the short answer.
Thank you very much. So we've got a couple more questions, but there's one from Vincent around training, which I'll come to in a moment for John. So there's a question here, the next most voted one from Ioannis. Will the updates be carried out only via internet automatically? I assume for S100. What if there's a problem with the connection? Will there be any predictions to the real-time information display so that even if there's no connection, there'll be some information shown?
So I think this really is covering quite a few points actually. One which is around the communication, and this has, as everyone will be aware, in the last few years really taken off at pace. We now have low Earth orbit satellite constellations like OneWeb, like Starlink, which offer connectivity speeds like we've never seen before. It's like moving from dial-up to broadband, and it really is revolutionary, and it will enable us to transfer more data than has ever been possible before, really. And a lot of the constraints that we had previously around the transfer of information suddenly don't become a problem anymore when you have that level of connectivity. And I think the stability of those services is pretty good, it's pretty reliable, and because there is less distance between the satellite and the vessel, there's a lot less latency in the service as well. So the reliability of the connection is a lot greater than you would have with more traditional satellite technologies. So this is proving to be a real game changer. In actual fact, we're seeing a lot of uptake in the industry at the moment for these services. Initially, maybe more for crew welfare, but actually once they realise the benefits of having those systems on board and how much data you can actually transfer very easily, I think we will start to see many, many more connected ECDIS systems in the future. And I think really this is the way it needs to go to leverage the most out of the S100 ecosystem. If you have connected systems, we have the ability to, as you said, send all of this data to the vessel as and when it's ready. Rather than waiting for a weekly drop of information, we can just drip feed all of that information to the mariner so they have the latest information at all times. But I think the question really was about the fact that if the connection goes down, what do you do? What's the ability? Obviously, at the moment, some vessels go for many weeks without updating their charts. So it's going to be no different to what you have today. But the ability for ECDIS systems to take real-time data is a significant issue which needs to be, there's some significant issues which need to be overcome first, I think, before that really becomes a reality. I think technically it's very possible, but would the mariner be happy about a tide gauge going into a port that they've never been to before, adjusting their depth information, and they don't know the validity of that information that's coming out of there? Is it correct? Who's validated it? Is it, Is it spurious information? All of these things are questions which would need to be addressed before I think anyone would want their information, which has come from an official source, being tampered with. Because, you know, as we talked about already, S-100 data delivered through hydrographic offices and value-added resellers is all digitally signed, and the mariners know that it's come from an official source. If it's just being broadcast from a port wall, who's to validate that information and everything else? So there are some significant issues which will need to be resolved before I think we'll see ECDIS systems really taking real-time data and adjusting any information in your ECDIS system for that information.
Okay, thanks. So I've just got a couple more questions, and actually coming to you, John. There's also the next most prioritised question. So I'll blend them together, and then. So yeah, I mean, shipping companies and crews obviously are wondering about the training requirement for crews to be able to safely operate an S-100 enabled ECDIS. And the question, which was posted by Vincent, would there be any new training requirements for working with S-100? And from a training perspective, how different would the ECDIS be from what we have today? And I think that's all wrapped up in the question of how do we ensure that the crews have the skills and capability to operate the latest equipment?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of levels of this. There's sort of for our members or the ship operators and owners, there's the external side of it and an internal side of it, and there's quick wins and then the long-term potential, long-term goals. So what do I mean by that? So I think because of the dates that Tom's outlined, as is common in our industry, the technology is moving at a pace, whereas the training seems to be, and I'm not 100%, but a little bit behind that. So the short term really will be that the model course that exists currently will certainly need updated. From all the things that we've heard, which clearly isn't everything, it's just a snapshot of some of the positive changes. And as I said in my first answer, these are positive changes as long as the changes are understood and applied properly. So they need to really update that model course, which Tom informs me is sort of being looked at a higher level. The long-term goal, in my personal opinion, would be that ECDIS needs to be at the forefront of all navigational training rather than a bolt-on course or part of another simulated course, such as bridge team management, bridge and resource management. Your day-to-day training from cadet all the way through to master, all the navigation you do there needs to include more work with ECDIS. It is apparent that there is still quite a lot of paper chart navigation going on in the colleges around the world, and then the crews are getting on board and being faced with no paper at all. And you know, before everybody gets all excited about that, I'm not suggesting the end and no paper chart training whatsoever. It is a basis, a foundation, and I understand that. You know, you've got to understand the basics and the foundations before we move on. All I'm suggesting is that the use of ECDIS from day one of your training needs to be made more realistic. But that's a long-term thing. For the short term, really, to meet the kind of dates that have been talked about at IMO for this rollout, it would have to be a slight change to the model course. In an ideal world, you probably wouldn't need the model course, just like you don't need a bolt-on for paper navigation, because you've learned it all the way through. The internal part of that I was talking about, of course, is the type-specific or onboard familiarization rather than the generic training. And that, I think, will be something that our members, ship operator owners, and us as a loss prevention team, as more and more information becomes concrete about the S-100 requirements, we'll have to have a long, hard look at, because you will have mixed fleets because of the no hard changeover, as it were. You will have some vessels operating S-57, some S-100, some bit of both, and you'll have officers that are moving between those vessels. So familiarization, which is already something that's very difficult to do in general in the industry, one guy's going up the gangway as another guy's going down, is going to become more difficult because there'll be a greater amount of changes in that bridge equipment across just one fleet of ships, for example. So the familiarization aspect of it and that generic is, that type specific is probably going to be more difficult. It's going to need some real thought. Some members are lucky enough to have their own training centres and things like that, and that, of course, will be easier for them. But all in all, that internal familiarization has always needed a bit of a refresh anyway, but it's going to be a difficult time, I think, that one. And that includes things like the procedures for use as well. So at the moment, crew members are supposed to familiarize themselves with the requirements laid out in their SMS, which will include passage planning with ECDIS. And now you may need two, depending on the equipment on that vessel in that dual fuel period. So in answer to the question, we need to see what the actual outcome is, the full outcome when it's fully signed off, and then work on that type specific. And they're already looking at it at a higher level, IMO STCW, for, I assume, changes to the model course that will incorporate it. My personal wish would be that there was more ECDIS use from the word go, phase 1 in the cadetship, so that those model courses weren't needed. It was just the way we do things.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, the next question, just to thank Emiliano for the question, has been covered off by that. So thank you. So before we go to being led by the audience's question, just one final question for you, Tom, in terms of what progress is being made by with ECDIS manufacturers to develop and test S-100 data.
Thanks, Guy. UKHO have a big programme on at the moment with the French Hydrographic Office, CHOM, in developing test data for use in a testbed across the English Channel, through the Channel Islands and into St Malo. And we're working with a range of ECDIS manufacturers. We're working with Furuno, we're working with Seven Seas, Navtor and OSI to help them develop the next generation of S-100 ECDIS systems. And we're providing all of the data into this trial to be able to hopefully prove the use case for the new S-100 ECDIS systems, but also to gather the evidence necessary to bring to IMO that the introduction of an S-100 ECDIS system in dual fuel mode will not adversely impact the navigational safety of the vessel. That was the first objective of the trial. But as we've worked with the manufacturers and worked with the industry partners, what we've realised is there are a lot of other benefits that we're going to get from this trial. And we need to extract from the trial as many of the user benefits of transitioning to this data as possible. So we're working with Condor Ferries to be able to use their mariners and do some onshore familiarisation training with the new systems with them, and then step through a series of shore-based tests with their mariners, comparing what they would do with S57 charts to the new, I suppose, the procedures like John's just talked about of how you would go about using that new data onshore, and how you would compare and contrast the two operations using that new S-100 data. And from those shore-based trials, which we're hoping will be conducted in January of 2025, we'll move quite quickly onto some real live sea trials across that trial area that I've just talked about. So we will be trialling the S101 ENCs, the S102 high resolution bathymetry, the S104 tidal water level data sets in a range of modes actually. Like Michelle's talked about, we will have forecast information that will be derived, some from tidal harmonics, some from tidal models, and we will also have some S111 data as well at varying grid resolutions. So we're really trying to understand where the user benefit comes from, all of that information used as a stack together. And the results of the trial we expect to be used to support the business case for the introduction of S-100 ECDIS. So as well as feeding back into the standards development side at the UKHO, we'll also be hopefully being able to explain to end users why they should look to this new data, what it can offer, what the advantages, and really explore all of those things that we've talked about today. Once we've got to a relatively stable point in that trial, it's also expected that we will be making that data available similar to the way that Canada are doing this in an international collaboration, so making that data available to anyone who wants that to conduct their own trials and testing as well. So there are some moves afoot to make that happen, because we really want to support the development of the next generation navigational products.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to move on to the questions now, which are plentiful. So thank you. The first one that's got the most votes is from Lorenzo, and it says, "How will S-201 aids to navigation information differ from NavAids information, which will be available in S-101?"
Okay, that'll be me again. So what we expect is that the data framework doesn't need to be for products that will end up in all products that will end up in ECDIS systems. What I expect is that a lot of the product specifications that are being developed at the moment are for the transfer of information between the originator, maybe to a hydrographic office, so that they can then create another product. And this is how I see the S10, the S2 series of information really being the transfer mechanism to get information into hydrographic offices in a standardized form, so that improve the ingest of all of that information, make sure that it can be validated and everything else, all those good things, and provide a standardized form for the ingest of all of that. And this may be similar for other data products that other domain users are creating. It may be more for the transfer of the information rather than it being a product that the ECDIS system would natively display. Because it's as you can rightly see, if there's an S101 ENC with buoys on, and then you send it a data set with a load of buoys, S201 or whatever the number was, apologies, then you're going to end up getting a conflict if you had both on the screen at the same time. So it's not really intended in that way. I think in this instance, I see it more as a transfer mechanism to get the data in a standard format for hydrographic offices.
Okay, thanks. John, coming to you next. This is from Anonymous, but is there a risk of supplying too much data to the mariner navigating rather than highlighting the safety critical?
That's always a risk. That was a risk, as we've seen, as I said before, with S57, that they could overclutter the screen and therefore actually have too much information there for them to navigate safely. I think a lot of that sits with that. As I mentioned in the last question you asked me, it was about training, but I mentioned in their familiarization and procedural based items, if the training is done properly throughout, then they will be able to use that to ensure that there is enough data that they need to use, and that should be backed up by their familiarization and best practice that's laid out in their SMS. So yes, what essentially using too much data is just kind of misuse. And as I said in the very first question, if we understand it and we use it properly, then there are benefits. There were benefits to S57.
Good.
You know, let's be clear. It's not getting dumped because it wasn't good enough. But that was not necessarily understood, not used properly in all cases, not put everybody in the same pot, but and it has led to incidents, and it'll be the same here if we don't get on top of that familiarisation, SMS, and the understanding for the crew members, the people, the cold face, as it were. So yes, there is a risk that we head down that path again, but hopefully not. With things such as this highlighting what's coming, then we can get on top of that problem. And like I said, once there's things more concrete in place, then we will start that information provision as well.
Okay, thanks.
Guy, can I just interject?
Of course.
Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of those data sets, but it's intended that they work in combination. And when you take S-102 and S-104, what they essentially do is move a safety contour. So whilst it's two data sets that are being delivered to the ECDIS, the visible, tangible realisation of that is just a safety contour. So we're not overloading the screen with lots of additional data. I think it's really important to understand that this is not suddenly a bombarding of the S101 E&C with loads of additional portrayal that's going to be really busy and the user's going to not understand what these things are. I think a lot of these layers will be toggles on and off. So in the passage planning phase, they will be very, very useful in that stage for the collation of all of that information together. John talked about the appraisal stage. All of these stages in the process is where you'll be using all of that information and gathering it together. But when you're actually monitoring in monitoring mode in the ECDIS system, you're going to have very little additional information on the screen that would, over and above what you have today, that would cause navigational incident or distract you from the job of navigating, I think. So we're not radically changing the operational view when you're actually underway at all. I don't think that's really what was intended with it. And hopefully we've cleared up a bit of a misunderstanding there.
Yeah, okay. And the point you made earlier about the refinement of text placement and the more flexibility there as well. Michelle, there's a question which touched on something you talked about earlier, which others may wish to contribute as well. But do you think that S-100 can support our impact on climate change?
Yeah, I do. I think from the trials that are going on within industry at the moment, I think demonstrate that there's a real potential for that. As I said, I don't think it solves everything, and I think what it can do is look at some of the cheaper, quicker wins that we can together use to make that move. With the introduction of greener, cleaner fuels, as I mentioned, and anti-fouling paints, it just takes that first step to supporting the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and supporting climate change, absolutely.
I think it will also, even if you're using green fuels, have the ability to reduce your cost. So I think, with better granular data, a lot more intelligent decision making can be done, and that will result in reduced cost, hopefully, for the end users and for shipping companies. So even if that's in traditional fuels or the low sulfur fuels or in the greener fuels that Michelle's just been talking about, this data will be the way in which you can keep those costs to the minimum. And I think that's really important. It's not just for today, it's for tomorrow and the next day and everything else after.
Okay, thanks. So the next question, which I suspect is for you, Tom. Are there any integrations for shore-based GIS platforms such as ArcGIS or QGIS?
So the formats that have been used for S100 product specifications at the moment would, I think, allow the ability for those data sets to be able to be used in GIS systems. So we use HDF5 format for the gridded information S102 and S104, S111. GML is used for the navigational warnings, I believe, and we're using ISO 8211 for ENCs, which is what we used previously with S57. So if those GIS systems can accommodate those data formats, then there shouldn't be a problem with the display of S-100 data in those applications.
Okay. And I'm going to stay with you. I know this is a topic that you are, it's close to your heart. S-100 relating to cybersecurity. So I think we can interpret the question as, does it create more resilience in a world where cybersecurity is more prevalent?
Yeah, and I think that's, hopefully I touched a little bit on that earlier on in the questions we had, but we have really taken strides to improve the security of our S-100 data, given that with more connected systems than ever before, the chance of a cyber attack and everything is significantly increased. And ships are no longer floating boxes out at sea where they are away for days and days at a time, operating very insular. They're now fully connected. There's a lot more operations that are happening onshore and that are sent over to the ship. I think this will only increase with the connectivity that we now have available, and is a way in which we're moving. So the protection of our data to the highest level is going to be paramount to ensure that what gets into the system hasn't been tampered with, doesn't have a virus in it, etc. So S-100 definitely has been designed in that way, and I'm at the moment leading a working group at the UKHO that is looking to improve the resilience in the way in which we appoint people into the UKHO security scheme. So there'll be a very robust mechanism in place that will only allow bona fide manufacturers and data servers into the S-100 scheme to ensure the protection of the data and the scheme, to make sure that we hopefully don't suffer any issues with our S-100 information.
Okay, thanks. Just to highlight, there's lots of questions, and as I said, I'm going through them in priority order. So please don't forget to prioritise the questions that have maybe come in since you previously looked, just to make sure that we're directing the conversation in the way that you want us to. There's a question from Jason. Are there any maritime areas that have gathered all of the relevant data for full implementation of S-100 in their region, and therefore can act as an example data set that others can learn from? I don't know if that's relevant to the trial or your experience, so I'll...
When you go and I'll follow
Yeah,
on.
so no Hydrographic Office, as I'm aware at the moment, has transformed all of their current data into S-100 information. I mean, it's a large task, and primarily, I think, one which hasn't been undertaken as of yet because of the immaturity of the UKHO standards. We are at the real knife edge, if you like, at the moment, where we're expecting all of the phase 1 product specifications to be approved by the UKHO in December, which will then allow them to be operational effectively, which means that they're at a point which operational data can now be developed against them. And I think that's what a lot of the hydrographic officers were waiting for before they start native production of that information. You can't start mass production of all of your data sets on standards which are immature and constantly changing. So there was a bit of a waiting game for that to happen, but we are now there, and this will give the stability necessary for hydrographic offices to start production of those data sets. It will also mean that the manufacturers of the tools that we'll be using to create those data sets have the assurance that we're at a stable point in the development process of those product specifications, and they can develop the tools necessary to produce the outputs to those specifications for us. So that's there was a few things that needed to happen there for us to be able to get to that position. But I think the short answer is, guys, no, there isn't a single hydrographic office that has all of their S-100 data ready now to go go out to the mariner.
But
Sorry, and I think what's important to note as well is one of the areas that we're looking at is intelligent coverage, so not just supplying blanket S-100 coverage everywhere. I think it's important to look at where there's user value. So, for example, there's little need for water level information out in oceanic areas or even some coastal areas where there's 100 metres of clear water underneath you. So making sure that where we do put time and effort into that conversion, that there's user value to that as well.
Okay. The next question, actually, you did touch on at the end of your previous answer, Tom. It's an anonymous question, but it was around how much our software providers, such as Caris, involved and ready and involved with discussions of and developments of new symbols.
New symbols?
Yeah.
Yeah, so many of the production tool manufacturers are involved at the IHO in all of the discussions that we're having around S-100, as well as the people who are building the validation software. So all of these organisations are really integral as well to the IHO, and their expert contributions to the work of the IHO mean that we're at the point we are now. We've really leveraged on their expertise to help us with the development of a lot of these standards. So I think, we're in a good place. All of the main contributors to the work of S-100 have been industry players that you would expect to be involved in this type of work. I think it's been a good collaboration with industry to get to the point we are now.
Yeah, I mean, much like the key routes, collaboration is obviously very important. The next question is from Pierre Eves. S-100 standards specify data sets and behaviours of ECDIS. With more and more connectivity, is there any specification about how to transfer this data and about protocols for automatic updates between producer, distributor and consumer? Or will the standards only specify file level updates? I think we know that question's coming to you.
Morning, how are you? So I think this is a bit of a leading question, because there is some work at the moment ongoing at the IMO to determine whether CCOM, which is a IEC standard, will be used for the transfer of information, S-100 information, into the ECDIS. And that conversation is happening this week, and we will understand a lot more after this session at the IMO as to how that will develop, whether that or whether it is specified in the S-100 performance standard for ECDIS systems, or whether this becomes something that the IHO pick up and contribute to in S-98. I think there are various options in terms of how that will develop, and I think we will know a lot more in the next few weeks about which direction that's likely to go. So,
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah. Thank you.
After the MSC meeting, we will be able to know what's happening.
Okay. Michelle, how are Admiralty sailing directions going to change with the new S-100 changes? Do we expect users to be able to review more sailing direction data on the charts?
Yeah, so the publications information is part of the S-100 Phase 2 products and services. So that's something that will be looked at after the release of the Phase 1 product specifications. As with the benefits that we've proven from the S-100 Phase 1, I think what we have already established is that the introduction of S-100 provides greater access to hydrographic information. So to answer the question, I think that the Phase 2 release will just greater support the access of sailing direction information and make it more accessible to the user.
Okay. John, I'm going to come to you for the next one. Thank you, Michelle. Sorry. If you could see 20 years into the future, what is the biggest impact S-100 standards would have had?
Big one, I think. We discussed this before, really. Whilst I understand it's not entirely ready for it yet, it is on the way to assisting all autonomous vessels, I think. And I mean, 20 years in the future, they're already here, aren't they? You know, they're already here, they're already operating. And I think that for people like P&I clubs, they are a little bit of an unknown sort of quantity, if you like. The regulations for them are still being built and on the move. And so S-100 could really set a standard, at least a navigation standard there for those, for risk assessments on those vessels. So yeah, I think that's already been thought of, and whilst it's not, I understand from Tom, 100% here yet with regard to S-100, it is a part of the thinking process at the moment. So I can see it knocking on to that next generation of automation, I suppose.
I mean, following on from what John said, the UKHO have set up a working group specifically looking at MASS and looking at how maritime autonomous surface ships, and looking at how potentially S-100 needs to evolve and change over time to accommodate the new requirements for those vessels. And that's the beauty of S-100, is it's extensible, it's flexible, it can accommodate technological change without the need to upset the S-101 ENCs that we're producing or the S-102 data that we're producing. So we can extend S-100 in any direction we wish, and it will have no impact on the S-100 data that's being produced by hydrographic offices. Whereas previously with S-57, that wouldn't have necessarily been the case. But yeah, we won't have the same issues extending S-100 as we did with S-57.
Okay, so there is a question from Zelko, actually on something you touched on earlier in terms of data validity, I think. But currently, under SOLAS, the National Hydrographic Office are the issuing authority for official navigational charts and are responsible for the data quality. In the S-100 ECDIS environment, will that formal responsibility be shared amongst different stakeholders and data providers, or remain with the Hydrographic Office?
Yeah. So I think this really depends on the nation as to whether or not the organisations producing the data are prepared to underwrite the validity of that information. If they are, then that's great. Then they obviously can contribute to that. Whether that would have to be digitally signed by the Hydrographic Office or whether they would be able to deliver that directly to a vessel remains to be seen. And I think it's probably the case where we're still going to have the same operational construct as we had previously, with the ranks being the repository for all of the S-100 data, where it can be validated, where it can be then distributed to value-added resellers, which will then be the conduit for that information to the vessels, so that at every stage you can be assured that the information is going through the correct channels to keep that vessel safe. And I think that probably plays into, John, some of the insurance issues that you would foresee coming up if people were taking data from other organisations and trying to put it into their ECDIS.
It's the same now, isn't it? It's the same when I was at sea. We'd expect people to have, say, UKHO charts, and we have touched on it in the past during casual conversations, not one sellotape together from God knows where. So it's a similar thing to that, really.
Okay. I've been watching this question creep up because it did come up when we were in Hamburg in every session we ran, but it's anonymous. But will existing ECDIS systems be required to be updated by 2029, or does the new IMO performance standard only apply to new systems?
Yeah, it's the latter. So it only applies to new systems at the moment. I think there would have to be more information available for the IMO to make the decision to make S-100 ECDIS systems mandatory carriage. And I think this is where test beds and experience with the first generation of S-100 users will really come to the fore, because from their experience and the data gathered through that period of time, we will be able to evidence the reasons why the IMO should maybe look to mandate S-100 ECDIS. If we can prove the safety case, if we can prove the operational benefits, then the chances of being able to convince the IMO that this is the right direction and we should put in place a rolling programme similar to the one we had when we introduced ECDIS in the first place, we could see a rolling programme of the introduction of S-100 ECDIS over time. But I think that is some way off. Myself and Michelle were talking about at what point do we think S-57 will be retired, or when will that happen? And again, that's something that the IHO will have to keep IMO informed of as hydrographic offices convert their data from S-57 to S-101. We're going to start to see a shift where we've gone from maybe 20% of hydrographic offices have S-101 data, then it will be 50%, then it will be 75%, and eventually we're going to get to 100%. And it's at that point you can start to think, well, now's the time we can retire S-57. So I think that's really where we are.
Okay. We've just got time for just one final question. What should we expect as an improvement to charting with regards to the contours on S-101 that would also assist the navigation inside the safety contour and plotting of no-go areas?
Plotting of no-go areas will be manual anyway, as it is now, I imagine. That was one of the things that came up in the Libra, actually, was that although it was paper at the time, they didn't put a no-go area on. Right. And something we still see in S-57, that they don't manually put on no-go areas, the crew, and no doubt we'll see it in S-100 as well. Navigating behind, I suppose it's because it's not set contours like 5, 10, 15, then when you see something that you shouldn't be navigating behind, then you genuinely shouldn't be navigating behind it, because it will be specific to your draft and that situation, rather than at the moment where, as Tom outlined you could be 8, 10 metres of navigable water behind the current because you've only got set 5, 10 metre contours or whatever. So hopefully that problem should vanish, if you like.
The other point is that within S-57 we do have the ability to create high density ENCs which have additional contours in them. But this is not something that's been widely adopted by every hydrographic office. But if hydrographic offices want to have an interim step between that and your S-102 data, then this provides a mechanism to quickly get high resolution information out to the end user in the port environment so that they can set accurate safety contours in that area. So if you did have a high definition ENC with a 12 metre contour, then the ECDIS system will automatically pick up that 12 metre contour. It doesn't need any software upgrades or anything else to be able to display that data.
Okay, thanks. So that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for your questions. If you found today's webinar interesting, would like to learn more, last week we published a report with Thetis, which explores the benefits of S-100 in more detail, and that's available on the Admiralty website, along with more information on the topic. We'll continue to share information and guidance on this over the coming months and years, I suspect. And your feedback's really important to be able to help shape the content that we create to support you. So if you can please complete the feedback survey that's in the Q&A box, that will go a long way to helping that. There's also a QR code on screen which you can just quickly scan with your phone. Just want to say thank you to the panellists once again, and thank you very much for everyone tuning in and taking the time out of your day.